A child screamed. Not the kind from a scraped knee or a bad dream. This was raw. Animal. A sound that bounced off stone walls and came back wrong. Then another child screamed. Then a third. Something heavy hit glass and shattered it. But the glass wasn't a window. It was a mirror. A full sheet of polished surface buried behind a collapsed wall in the oldest part of the settlement. The children had found it while playing. They looked into it. And what looked back was not them. The reflection smiled when the children didn't. Moved half a second too late. Stared back with expressions no child had made. A girl named Lyra was the first one to speak after the silence fell. What she whispered next sent the entire community into a panic that would crack open 9 generations of buried lies. Stay with me on this one. Now, before I tell you what Lyra whispered, you need to understand where these people lived. Because this wasn't a town. It wasn't a city. It was a sealed underground settlement called Halden Rift, and nobody inside it had seen the sky in over 200 years. 9 generations back, something poisoned the surface. The records don't agree on what it was. Some say chemical. Some say biological. Some say it doesn't matter because the result was the same. The air turned toxic. The water turned black. And the people who survived did the only thing they could. They went underground, sealed the doors behind them, and swore they'd come back up when it was safe. They never came back up. Over time, the settlement grew. Tunnels became corridors. Corridors became districts. They had farms lit by engineered light, water pulled from deep wells, schools, a governing council, and a system of laws that kept everything running tight. Tight was the word people used. Not free. Not open. Tight. And one of those laws, one that nobody questioned anymore, was the ban on mirrors. Now here's the thing. It didn't start as a law. The first generation still had mirrors. They used them the same way you and I do. Brushing teeth, checking their face, normal things. But within a few decades, people started reporting something off. Their reflections didn't look right. Small things at first. A delay in movement. A blink that didn't match. Some said their reflection looked older. Some said it looked like someone else entirely. The council called it stress. Isolation psychosis. They said the dim lighting underground played tricks. That made sense for a while. But reports kept coming. And then a woman named Sarah Voss, second generation, she walked into the council chamber and said her reflection had smiled at her while she was crying. She wasn't the only one. Dozens of people said the same thing in the same month. So the council banned mirrors. First from public spaces. Then from homes. Within 2 generations, every reflective surface in Halden Rift was dulled, covered, or destroyed. And here's what replaced them. Portraits. Every citizen of Halden Rift had a portrait painted at age 6, then again at 12, then every 10 years after that. If you wanted to know what you looked like, someone told you. Someone painted you. Someone described the shape of your jaw or the color of your eyes. Your identity wasn't something you discovered yourself. It was something other people gave you. Think about that for a second. Nobody in Halden Rift had seen their own face since before their grandparents' were born. Lyra grew up in this. She was 23. Tall, or so people told her. Dark hair, or so her portrait showed. She worked in the lower sectors as a caretaker for the youngest children. She was good at it. Patient. Steady. The kind of person who didn't raise her voice because she didn't need to. She had a routine. Every morning she walked the children through the old corridors near the foundation walls. It was exercise. It was education. She'd point at the old stonework and tell them this was where the first settlers had lived. The children would touch the walls and ask questions, and she'd answer the ones she could. That particular morning, 6 children. Ages 5 through 9. Lyra at the front. The route was the same one she always took. Except one of the kids, a boy named Oren, found a crack in the wall where there hadn't been one before. A section of old stone had shifted overnight. Behind it, a space. Lyra told them to stay back. They didn't. Kids never do. Now I need to tell you about Kale. Because Kale is the reason this story goes where it goes. Kale was a warden. That's what Halden Rift called the people who enforced the council's laws. They wore gray. They carried short metal rods that could stun a person cold. They didn't smile much. They patrolled the corridors and made sure life stayed tight. Kale was good at his job and he hated it. He was 30, broad across the shoulders, quiet in a way that made people nervous. He wasn't cruel. That was the problem. The wardens needed people who didn't ask questions, and Kale asked them constantly. Just never out loud. He'd watched Lyra before. Not officially. Not on orders. He'd seen her walking the children, and something about the way she moved through the corridors, unhurried, unafraid, it pulled at him. He never said a word to her. Never got close. But he knew her route better than she did. The day the children found the crack in the wall, Kale was 40 meters behind them. Close enough to hear the first scream. The space behind the wall was small. Maybe 3 meters deep, 2 meters wide. It had been sealed for a long time. The air inside tasted stale. Dust hung in it like fog. And leaning against the back wall, covered in a thin layer of grime but somehow still intact, was a mirror. Not a hand mirror. Not a fragment. A full standing mirror, taller than Lyra, framed in dark metal that had gone green with age. The glass was smooth. Untouched. Perfect. The children found it before Lyra could stop them. Oren was first. He stepped into the space, looked up at the glass, and froze. For about 2 seconds, nothing happened. Then he made a sound. Not a scream. Not yet. A whimper. The kind of sound a child makes when something is wrong but they don't have the words for it. Lyra pushed past the other kids and grabbed Oren's shoulder. She pulled him back. But her eyes went to the mirror as she did it. She couldn't help it. And what she saw made her hands go still. Her reflection was looking at her. But the face was wrong. Not distorted. Not blurry. But wrong. The features were close to what her portrait showed but off by degrees she couldn't name. The nose was different. The jaw was sharper than people had described. The eyes were a color she'd never been told. And the expression was calm. Patient. Like it had been waiting. Lyra was not calm. Lyra was staring, open-mouthed, heart-hammering. But her reflection just stood there with its hands at its sides, watching her the way a person watches an animal through glass. Then it smiled. Lyra was not smiling. The children were already screaming by then. Each one who'd glanced at the mirror saw the same kind of thing. Their own face but not their own face. Movements that didn't match. Expressions that didn't belong to them. A girl named Tessa saw her reflection raise a hand she hadn't raised. A boy named Finn saw his reflection turn its head before he turned his. Lyra grabbed the children. All 6 of them. She pulled them out of the space and back into the corridor. Oren was crying. Tessa was shaking. The others just looked blank, the way children look when something has scared them past the point of reaction. 40 meters away, Kale broke into a run. He reached them in seconds. The children were clustered against Lyra. She was on her knees, arms around as many of them as she could hold, breathing hard. Kale looked at her face and then looked at the crack in the wall and then looked at her face again. He didn't ask what happened. He looked into the space. He saw the mirror. And here's the part that mattered. Here's the thing Lyra noticed even through her fear. Kale wasn't surprised. His face didn't change. No shock. No confusion. He stared at the mirror for a long moment, jaw tight, and then he turned around and pulled a comm unit from his belt and called it in. His voice was flat. Controlled. He used a code Lyra had never heard. Within 4 minutes, 3 more wardens arrived. Within 10, a council member. Within 20, the space was sealed with welded steel. The council held an emergency session that evening. The children and Lyra were brought in to give accounts. The council listened. They asked careful questions. And then the head of the council, a woman named Dae Yun who had held the seat for 18 years, gave the official explanation. The mirror, she said, was a relic from the first generation. The glass had degraded over 2 centuries. The distortions were caused by imperfections in the surface, warped by age and chemical exposure. The dim lighting in the old sector made the distortions appear to move. The children were scared because they had never seen a mirror before and didn't understand how reflection works. It was a good explanation. It was clean. It covered every detail. The community accepted it within a day. Believe me, people wanted to accept it. Because the alternative was something nobody was ready to think about. The sealed space was marked off limits. The children were given a day off from their routines. Parents held them a little tighter that night. Lyra filed her report with the educational board and received a note thanking her for her diligence and reminding her that unauthorized exploration of Foundation areas was against policy. And that was that. Lyra went home. She sat on the edge of her bed in her small quarters in the midsector. She poured water from a jug and drank it slowly. Her hands were steady now. The fear had drained out of her over the hours since the council session, replaced by something duller. Tiredness, maybe. Or the simple relief of having an explanation that made the world make sense again. She set the cup down. She pulled off her boots. She lay back on her bed and stared at the ceiling, which was low and gray and familiar. The hum of the air systems was constant, the same sound she'd fallen asleep to every night of her life. The same sound everyone in Halden Rift fell asleep to. Steady. Mechanical. The mirror was sealed. The explanation held. The children would forget. Life in Halden Rift would continue the way it always had. Tight and controlled and underground and fine. Lyra closed her eyes. The explanation made sense. It really did. A degraded surface. Bad lighting. Frightened children who'd never seen a mirror. That was all it was. Except for one thing. The reflection had smiled at her. Not a warped image. Not a trick of light. It had smiled. A real smile, slow and deliberate, on a face that was almost hers but not quite. A face that looked like it recognized her even though she had never seen it before in her life. Lyra opened her eyes. She stared at the ceiling. She didn't sleep that night. 3 days later, Lyra saw it. She was washing her hands in the basin in her quarters. The water was low. The light was dim, the way it always got in the midsector during the evening cycle. She reached for the cloth to dry her hands and glanced down. And stopped. Her fingers were wrong. Not broken. Not injured. Wrong. They were longer than they should have been. Just slightly. Maybe a centimeter. And the nails. The nails had a curve to them she hadn't noticed before. Not like they'd grown. Like they'd changed shape. Like the bone underneath had shifted. Lyra held her hands up in the dim light and turned them slowly. She pressed her fingers together. Spread them apart. The joints moved fine. Nothing hurt. But the proportions were off. She knew her own hands. She'd looked at them every day of her life. These were not quite her hands. She told herself it was the light. The same explanation the council gave about the mirror. Bad lighting. Tricks. She almost believed it. Almost. Then she started looking at other people. Not obviously. Not in a way anyone would notice. She just paid attention. And once she started, she couldn't stop. The woman who ran the food distribution center had ears that sat too high on her head. A man in the upper corridor had pupils that didn't look round anymore. They looked vertical. Narrow. Like a slit cut into dark glass. A teenage boy in the education wing had shoulders that were too wide for his frame and moved in a way that wasn't quite right, like the muscles underneath were arranged differently than they should be. Nobody else seemed to notice. Or if they did, they didn't say anything. Because in Halden Rift, you didn't describe yourself. Other people described you. And other people had been looking at these slow changes for so long that they'd become normal. If everyone shifts a little at a time, and nobody has a mirror, who notices? The mirror noticed. That's what the reflections were. Not distortions. Not degraded glass. The mirror showed them what humans looked like. And they didn't look like that anymore. Lyra was standing in a corridor near the warden barracks, staring at nothing, when a hand closed around her arm. She turned and Cale was right there. Close enough that she could see the ring of gold around his pupils. Gold that shouldn't have been there. Gold that no portrait had ever recorded. He pulled her into an alcove. His grip didn't let up. "Stop looking at people," he said. His voice was low. Almost a whisper. But there was nothing gentle about it. "Stop it right now." "You saw the mirror," Lyra said. "You weren't surprised. That doesn't matter." "It matters to me. You looked at that mirror and you already knew what it would show." Cale's jaw tightened. He still had her arm. His thumb pressed into the inside of her wrist and she could feel her own pulse under his grip. Too fast. "The wardens know," he said. "We've always known." Every warden is briefed on their first day. The mirrors aren't banned because of superstition. They're banned because of what they show. What do they show? What we used to be. Lyra pulled her arm free. He let her. But he didn't step back. They were close enough that she could feel the heat coming off his skin. Close enough that she could see the way his canines were just slightly too long. She'd never noticed before. She was noticing everything now. How long has it been happening? She asked. Since the first generation. Something in the sealed environment triggered it. A mutation. Maybe the water. Maybe the engineered light. Maybe something in the rock itself. The council doesn't know, and they stopped trying to find out 4 generations ago. All they know is it's accelerating. Every generation changes more than the last. Changes into what? Cale didn't answer that. He looked at her for a long time. And she looked at him. And the thing between them, the thing that had been there since before the mirror, since the first time he'd watched her walk the children through the old corridors, it didn't go away. It got heavier. Because now she knew what he was. What she was. What all of them were. Something that used to be human. Something that wasn't anymore. Not fully. The children who saw the mirror, Lyra said. The council is watching them. Aren't they? Yes. They're watching me. Yes. And you're supposed to be the one watching. Cale didn't deny it. His hand came up again. Not to grab her this time. He touched the side of her jaw. But careful. The kind of touch that contradicted everything about his uniform, his rank, his orders. His fingers were warm. And they were too long. Just like hers. I'm telling you to stop, he said quietly. Not because I want to. Because if you keep going, they'll seal more than a mirror. If you're still with me, hit that subscribe button. Because this story is just getting started. Lyra didn't stop. Of course she didn't. Because now the question wasn't what was behind the mirror. The question was what the council had been hiding. And the answer was buried somewhere in the oldest part of Halden Rift, behind walls that had been sealed for 9 generations. She went to the children first. Not all 6. Just the 2 oldest. Orin, who was 9, and Tessa, who was 8. She found them during the midday meal and sat with them and asked a simple question. What did you see? Not what the council said you saw. What did you actually see? Orin looked at his hands. Then he looked at Lyra. I saw a boy, he said. He looked like me. But he didn't have claws. Lyra looked at Orin's hands. Short fingers. Nails curved tight against the fingertips. Not claws. Not yet. But close. Closer than last year. Closer than they should be. The mirror didn't lie. Everything else in Halden Rift did. Lyra found the archive on the 4th night. She'd been searching the old sector after curfew. Alone at first. Then not alone. Cale appeared behind her on the 2nd night without a word. He didn't try to stop her. He didn't help either. He just walked behind her with his stun rod holstered and his eyes on the corridors. Keeping watch. It was the closest thing to rebellion a warden had ever committed in Halden Rift, and neither of them talked about it. On the 4th night, Lyra found a door behind a false wall in the foundation level. The wall was stone. The door behind it was metal, heavy, sealed with a manual lock that had corroded to the point where one solid kick cracked it open. Cale caught her arm before she went in. If this is what I think it is, he said, we don't come back from it. I know. He let go. She went in. The room was small and cold and lined with metal shelving. On the shelves were containers. Dozens of them. Hard-sided, airtight, the kind designed to survive centuries. Lyra opened the first one. Inside were documents. Paper documents, handwritten, dated from the 1st generation. She opened a 2nd container. More documents. A 3rd. Medical files. Lab reports. Charts with data she didn't fully understand but could read well enough to know what they meant. The first settlers had known. Not immediately. Not all of them. But within the first 30 years underground, the medical officers had documented changes in the population that couldn't be explained by nutrition or environment alone. Bone density shifting. Muscle fiber restructuring. Sensory capacity expanding beyond normal human range. Night vision improving generation by generation. Hearing sharpening. reflexes accelerating, and the physical markers. Elongated fingers, curved nails, canine growth, subtle changes in the structure of the face, pupils adjusting shape, skin thickening. The medical officers had a word for it. They'd borrowed it from old surface biology texts. They called it phenotypic drift. But that was the polite term. The clinical term. In the margins of one report, a doctor named Hale Marin had written something less clinical. She'd written, "We are not sick. We are becoming something else. And I do not think it is reversible." Lyra sat on the cold floor and read for 2 hours. Cale stood in the doorway and let her. The picture that came together was ugly. The first-generation council had debated what to do. Some wanted to tell the population. Some wanted to open the surface doors and take their chances. But the majority voted to contain. Suppress the information. Ban the mirrors because the mirrors made the change visible. Replace them with portraits where the painter could soften what they saw. Let the change happen quietly, slowly, across generations, and hope that by the time it was undeniable, the population would have adapted enough not to care. They were wrong about that last part. People would care. People would care very much. The deepest container held the worst document. A single page. A directive from the second-generation council to the newly formed Warden Corps. It authorized the use of force against anyone who discovered the truth and attempted to spread it. Not arrest. Not containment. Elimination. The word was right there on the page. Clean and cold and underlined twice. Cale read it over her shoulder. She heard his breathing change. "Did you know about this?" she asked. "No. The briefing tells us about the change. It doesn't tell us about this. They killed people." "Yes. For knowing what they looked like." Cale didn't answer. He took the page from her hands and read it again. Then he folded it and put it inside his jacket. That was the moment. That was the exact moment he stopped being a warden and became something else. Lyra saw it happen. The shift in his posture. The way his shoulders dropped a fraction, like he'd set something heavy down. He looked at her. She looked at him. And the thing between them, the pull that had been building since before any of this started, it stopped being something either of them could ignore. He stepped forward. She didn't step back. He put his hands on either side of her face, and his palms were rough and warm, and his fingers curved along her jaw in a way that was gentle and desperate at the same time. He kissed her. She kissed him back. It lasted 3 seconds. Maybe 4. And when they pulled apart, neither of them pretended it hadn't happened. "We take the documents," Lyra said. "All of them. The council will come for us." "I know. Lyra. I know." They carried the containers out together. For trips. Oren and Tessa were waiting in the corridor because of course they were. Lyra had told them to stay home. They hadn't listened. Kids never do. Oren helped carry the last container. His hands gripped the metal edges and his curved nails scraped against the surface, and he didn't flinch. By morning, copies of the documents were spread across 3 sectors. Lyra had allies she didn't know she had. Other people who'd noticed the changes. Other people who'd stared at their own hands in low light and known something was wrong. A woman in the agricultural sector who'd started growing fur along her forearms and told no one. A man in water processing whose vision in total darkness was perfect and who'd been terrified of it for years. The truth moved through Halden Rift like water through cracks in stone. Unstoppable. The council called an emergency session. The head warden demanded Cale's arrest. Dae-Yun stood at the center of the council chamber and called for order, and no one listened. For the first time in 9 generations, the people of Halden Rift knew what they were. And they were furious. The fury lasted 3 days. People shouted in the corridors. They confronted wardens. They tore portraits off the walls and threw them on the ground because the portraits had been lying to them their whole lives. Softening their features. Rounding their pupils. Shortening their fingers. Making them look human when they hadn't been human for a very long time. Dae-Yun resigned on the 2nd day. She didn't fight it. She walked out of the council chamber, handed her seal to the nearest aide, and went back to her quarters. Some people expected her to make a speech. She didn't. She just left. And honestly, that said more than any speech could have. The wardens split. About half of them followed Kale. The other half stayed loyal to the old structure, but the old structure didn't exist anymore. Without a council head, without public trust, without the secret that had given them their authority, the loyalists had nothing to enforce. They holstered their stun rods. Some of them took off their gray jackets. A few walked into the agricultural sector and asked for work assignments as if they'd never carried weapons at all. Now here's the thing about people. They break fast and they mend slow. The anger burned hot, but it didn't burn long. Because once the shouting stopped, once the portraits were off the walls and the documents were public, people had to sit with a very simple question. Well, no, they weren't human. But they weren't monsters either. They were people who grew food and taught children and repaired water systems and argued about meal schedules. They had families. They had routines. They had a settlement that still needed to function, whether its residents had round pupils or vertical ones. Lyra was the one who suggested the mirrors. Not the old mirror. That one stayed sealed. But in the archive containers, alongside the documents, there had been a set of instructions. Technical specifications for manufacturing reflective glass using materials available in the settlement. The first generation had written them down before the ban. Maybe as insurance. Maybe because someone hoped that one day the ban would end. Lyra brought the specifications to the engineering sector. Within a week, they produced the first new mirror Halden Rift had seen in over a century. It was small. About the size of a dinner plate. Slightly warped at the edges. But it worked. They set it up in the central commons. And people came to look. Some couldn't do it. They walked up, stood in front of it, and turned away before their eyes could focus. The fear was too deep. Generations deep. Looking at your own face when you'd never done it before, when you'd been told your whole life that it was forbidden, that took a kind of courage that not everyone had on the first try. But some people looked. And what they saw was, well, it was them. Not what the portraits showed. Not what other people described. The actual shape of their own face. The real color of their eyes. The way their jaw curved. The way their brow sat. Features that were strange because they were new. Not because they were wrong. A woman in agricultural stared at her reflection for 10 full minutes. She touched the fine fur along her forearms. She looked at it in the mirror and then looked at it directly and then looked in the mirror again. Then she laughed. Not a happy laugh. Not a sad one. Just a laugh. The kind that comes when something you've been afraid of turns out to be real and you're still standing. Kale avoided the mirror for 2 weeks. Lyra didn't push him. She understood. He'd spent his entire adult life enforcing a lie he believed was protection. Seeing his own face meant seeing the thing he'd helped hide. That's a hard thing to do. When he finally looked, Lyra was beside him. He stood in front of the glass in the commons during the night cycle when nobody else was around. His reflection stared back. Gold-ringed pupils. Canines a little too long. Jaw heavier than any portrait had shown. Hands that were built for something other than holding a stun rod. He didn't say anything. Lyra put her hand on his back. He leaned into it. Just slightly. Just enough. The children adapted fastest. Because children always do. Within a month, the younger ones were making faces at their reflections and laughing. Oren spent an entire afternoon practicing expressions in the mirror, comparing what his face felt like with what it actually looked like. It was the most normal thing anyone in Halden Rift had done in 200 years. Lyra began teaching mirror classes. That's what they called them. She'd sit with the children in a circle around a mirror and they'd take turns looking. She taught them the words for what they saw. Not the old words from the portraits. New words. Honest ones. She taught them that the face in the mirror was theirs. Not a distortion. Not an error. On a quiet evening, about 2 months after the archive was opened, Lyra walked past the commons and saw something that stopped her. A girl. 5 years old. Standing in front of the mirror by herself. The girl's reflection looked back at her. It moved a fraction too late. Just like before. Just like always. The gap between what they were and what the glass remembered. The girl raised her hand. Slowly. Palm open. A wave. The reflection raised its hand a half-second behind. Palm open. A wave back. The girl smiled. The reflection smiled too. Almost at the same time. Close enough. Lyra leaned against the corridor wall and watched. And for the first time in a long time, she didn't feel afraid. Close enough was a good place to start.